Hello, Mayhemers and new visitors. This is Justin. I'm doing my first official podcast for the Mayhem Project tonight. I'm going to be exploring the topic of consciousness, which is a very broad and ill-defined concept that has been explored for many hundred years now. Consciousness, you might think of it as being awake or being aware of your surroundings, or sort of that general feeling of experiencing the world around you. And certainly those things are all true, but throughout history, we've gone through a lot of different definitions of consciousness, and we haven't reached a conclusion yet. The word consciousness in the English language appeared around the 1500s and wasn't really elaborated much until Descartes came along in 1637, publishing his Discourse on the Method, where he said, "I think, therefore I am." And basically, through his work, he realized that there's an internal world and an external world, the realm of the mind and the realm of thoughts, and then the realm of extension, or the realm of space. This led to what's considered to be dualism, where mind and body are two separate things. And then John Locke in 1690, with his paper about human understanding, he defined consciousness as an awareness of what passes through the mind. Certainly, when we think about definitions of consciousness, a lot of different things might come to mind. And certainly I think each and every one of them may have some degree of usefulness depending on what you're looking at. But for the purposes of this video, we are going to explore a wide variety of definitions and ideas about consciousness to sort of see if we can turn over some rocks and follow some breadcrumbs. I'm going to bring up a lot of things that in and of themselves could take up hours and hours and hours of podcasting, but I'm going to touch real lightly on some of this stuff and then kind of let you, my viewers, come to your own conclusions along the way. I want to start by giving some dictionary definitions of consciousness. One I have here from Webster's is awareness or perception of an inward psychological or spiritual fact, intuitively perceived knowledge of something in one's inner self, inward awareness of an external object, state, or fact, or concerned awareness. Another one is a state or activity that is characterized by sensation, emotion, volition, or thought. And of course in psychology, that's kind of where we define it as being sort of like, identity, sensation, perception, and all of those things, sort of the broadest possible sense of mind that you can possibly think of. The Cambridge Dictionary defines it as a state of understanding and realizing something. The Oxford Dictionary says the state of being aware and responsive to one's surroundings. So when we look at this, we see some different ideas of what consciousness might or might not mean. And even though when we say the word consciousness, we all sort of have this sort of intuitive understanding of what we're talking about, when it comes down to actually unpacking the concept of consciousness, I don't think we all are always talking about the same thing. In modern philosophy and the philosophy of mind, it kind of ranges across four major categories. Knowledge, so the sum total of things that you've learned in your life. Intentionality, so that sort of meaningful action that you take, sort of a conscious action on your environment. Introspection, which is that sort of awareness of what's passing through your mind. And then experience, which is, living. Sort of experiencing and remembering and making meaning of the world around us is certainly an important aspect of consciousness. Some believe that the only constraint on consciousness is that you just have to be aware of your external world. I mean, that certainly falls sort of within the medical definition of consciousness, which is like sort of the mind being aware of itself and its surroundings. You're awake. Versus you're knocked out on a table or a gurney. And certainly those are also useful definitions of consciousness, but I don't think it's exactly what we're getting at. And what we're going to do is sort of go over a wide variety of aspects of consciousness in this series. And in this video, I'm just going to start with putting forth a few of my own suggestions as well. I mean, working on this problem of consciousness has actually been a pretty deep passion of mine for about the past 15 to 20 years. And I think slowly, as we're exploring this topic, I may introduce some of the things that I've found, and you might find them helpful. So, I mean, some people believe that consciousness is this sort of like unitary and understandable and coherent thing. It's a noun. It's, it's something that if we try really, really hard, we might actually be able to arrive at a conclusion, about what consciousness means. And that's certainly been the pursuit of a lot of philosophers and a lot of scientists. And that's perfectly admirable. I mean, without that drive and that determination, how do we make headway? I don't necessarily agree that there is a conclusion. I believe that consciousness is sort of more like a verb. It's an unfolding process. It's a journey that is going to just continue until it doesn't. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm going to be coming from in all of this. And to understand really kind of like what science can and can't do with consciousness, I think is important too, because I mean, a lot of people want to rely on scientific findings to define their lives and to tell them what is okay and not okay to believe. I mean, and that's fine. It's good to want to stick to facts and stick to truth, but unfortunately, the facts about consciousness don't all belong to science. Unfortunately, science can't touch them all. And I'm going to kind of demonstrate some of that with you in this video. I'm going to give you a couple of activities, and I hope that they make you think, and I hope that they maybe help contribute to developing your own theory of mind, because like I said, we haven't yet come to a conclusion, and I think that it's certainly erroneous to believe that we have. Ned Block made a definition of consciousness as P consciousness and A consciousness. P consciousness is phenomenological consciousness. It's that part of consciousness that is experiencing the world around it. And then A is access consciousness, which is that part of consciousness that's able to verbally report what it's experiencing. And basically, according to those sort of like split definitions of consciousness, there's only one part of that can really be touched at all by science, and that's A, that's access consciousness. The phenomenological aspects of consciousness aren't readily available to measurement and don't lend themselves very well to scrutiny, because that's where you have the seat of subjective experience, which is also a huge definition of consciousness. A huge piece of this puzzle is subjective, qualitative experience, and there's only so far that science can go with that, at least if you're sticking to a very empirical, rigorous scientific method. There are some interesting crossovers, though. I mean, you have points in history where quantum physicists like David Bohm and Karl Pribram developed the holonomic model of the mind, which they believed that the consciousness is operating at a quantum level. And then other physicists took it even further to believe that the consciousness is responsible for collapsing the wave function. That sort of thinking has led to this very weird sort of blending between New Age philosophy and quantum physics. Like, oh, science and spirituality are the same thing. Well, I mean, there's always crossroads. There's always intersections. But I think that on the internet, especially, that sort of mindset has become self-satirizing and sort of comical. And I'm going to touch on some of that stuff, but I'm going to try to keep a very practical approach as we move forward. Another theory that I think is worth researching, I mean, I'm hoping that my viewers are going to take time to research some of this stuff, is the OR theory. It's like orchestrated ordering, I think it's called. And I haven't researched much on this myself, but it is the theory that consciousness is carried out inside of neurons rather than in the connections between neurons through something called micro tubules. From what I read, it's something that's non-computational. It's sort of like a random interaction with the universe, and I don't fully understand that. So maybe that's something that we can explore together as we move forward. What I'd like to introduce before we move any further is my preferred definition when I'm thinking about consciousness, because consciousness, like I said, it's complicated, it's broad. I mean, there's so very many pieces of philosophy and science that I'm just glazing over or ignoring completely for the sake of trying to cut you a half-hour long video. But for my purposes, I prefer to think of consciousness in a very simple functional definition as a mind operating in an environment. Okay, I want you to think about that for just a quick second. A mind operating in an environment. Now, I know that sounds highly simplistic, and it's meant to be, because I believe that all of the previous definitions of consciousness that I've already mentioned are all human-centric. They're all human-chauvinistic. They don't account for things like the consciousness of a newborn child or an animal or a plant or artificial intelligence or operating in a space that isn't in the universe. And I'm going to get to that, and we're going to do a little bit of that together, and I want to show you in real time how some of these things work, and I want you to sort of realize that you've already been operating in this way, and sort of like that, I don't know, it's like that, oh, there's that thing I'm missing, and it was right out in the open the whole time, you know. So a mind operating in the environment. I think of consciousness as a verb. I think I already mentioned that. Bucky Fuller said it best when he said, "I'm not a noun, I'm a verb. I'm a thing that's happening," to paraphrase him. But what I do want to bring out at this point before we go any further is the concept of panpsychism. So panpsychism is the belief or the thought that everything is conscious. I have no way of even evaluating that, because at that point we're talking about something I don't think that we would normally define as consciousness, and I think that I'm going to have to do a lot of deep searching to come to a conclusion about that. Can't say it's true, but I don't think I can buy it all either. So just to say, though, that panpsychism is another thing that you can look at in terms of exploring this concept of consciousness. So what I'd like you to do is follow me with an exercise right now. This is going to go back to what I was saying about non-local consciousness and aspects to like quantum physicists and like, you know, that holonomic brain theory, and where science is having a really hard time touching this concept because it's something that can really only be experienced at this point in time. Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary posited that there was a non-local quantum circuit of the brain in their 8-circuit theory model of consciousness. But what I'd like you to do is just relax yourself, close your eyes, and start taking some slow, deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth, just enough to get yourself relaxed. As you're doing this deep breathing, I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to envision yourself sitting at a park bench in front of a pond on a late spring, early summer day. Bright, beautiful, sunny day outside. Across the pond, you see maybe, you know, some rolling hills or some trees and some clouds in the distance. There may be a tree or two that's close to you. As you're sitting there on the bench, I want you to just start letting details become more clear. You can make these details yourself, whether it be, you know, how deep of a hue of green the grass is, the breeze as it's blowing through the leaves, and as you feel the sensation of it on your skin, the way the sunlight reflects off the slightly, you know, agitated surface of the pond from the breeze. As you're sitting there noticing these details, when you're nice and comfortable in this visual space, I want you to get up from the park bench, okay, and I want you to approach the pond, and I want you to reach down to the ground, and I want you to pluck a pebble off the ground, and I want you to skip it across the pond. When you skip it across the pond, you know, 1, 2, 5, 7, eventually it plops in there, just like you would expect a skipped rock to behave. Now I want you to open your eyes and think about what you just experienced. You know, if you have a fairly good imagination, you experience at least a slight sensation of what that environment felt like. You saw that sunlight, you saw that breeze, and if you didn't, after this video is done, I'd suggest that you try again. Very good if you're wanting to go to sleep, to do visualization exercises like this. But the part of this that I want to point out, and where this ties into what I'm talking about, is that when we think about space, we think of something that has 4 dimensions. It has length, it has width, and it has depth, and it has the passage of time. When you were in that visual space a few minutes ago, you experienced something that had width, something that had height, something that had depth. And if you notice those leaves blowing, or that reflection rippling off the pond, and when you skipped that rock, you experienced the passage of time. Whether or not that synced up with the passage of actual time outside of your mind is irrelevant. But what you experienced was a 4-dimensional space, just as real as you would have in your own body. The thing that I want to point out about that is that space is non-local. And when we say non-local, what we mean is non-locatable. It means it doesn't exist in space-time. It doesn't exist in a place that can be pinpointed by a coordinate system or found with a radar or a map or a really good detective or explorer. You're in a different space. You're in an inner space, a virtual space that your mind created. Certainly, science can look at the operation of the brain in an activity like that. You can look at it and think, wow, okay, so there's what the brain's doing when this person is doing this visualization exercise. But no matter how far they drill down, no matter how far they zoom in, no matter how many neurons they try to pluck out of your brain and look at under a microscope, they're never ever going to find you on that fucking park bench. It doesn't exist in space-time. It exists somewhere else. It's non-local, and it's one of those pieces of consciousness that science really can't touch. And that's why we did this exercise together, is because I just wanted to show you, in your own experience, a compelling reason to understand that there's a little bit of a deeper water to dive in here. Science can observe the indirect evidence of that operation and that process happening in the brain. But this brings us back to Descartes. So Descartes, he sort of arrived at the conclusion that all of consciousness is just happening in the brain. But with this exercise, we have to concede, at least somewhat, that it's not, because not only is there not a set of neurons that you can pluck out to find that park bench, but your brain is certainly not projecting a 3-dimensional hologram inside of your skull with a miniature scaled-down version of yourself experiencing that park bench in a scaled-down miniature space inside of your head. We know that's not how it works. So it's happening somewhere, not here. Okay, that's one way that your brain operates, and much the same when you're dreaming. There are altered states of consciousness that we'll explore in later videos that certainly touch on this aspect of non-locality as well. So we find that in the present, your brain can construct an environment to operate in, and that's why I use this concept of a mind operating in an environment. Because being aware of your external environment isn't enough to account for operating in that internal or virtual space. Also, when we develop artificial intelligence, if it develops any level of consciousness, any ability to interact in an environment, that may be a virtual environment. It may not be the external environment for a very, very long time. And I believe it's sort of important that we accommodate all of those aspects of reality, because if we have to exclude something that's actually happening in order to satisfy our pet beliefs, then we're definitely missing big pieces of the picture, and we're not quite dealing in reality at that point in time. So another thing I want to talk about is, so if consciousness is a verb, if it's a process, if it's not a noun, but rather it's an unfoldment, something that's just continuous, what is it that we're actually doing here? What is it that consciousness is doing? I believe that it's constructing. I believe that we're constructing not necessarily the material reality, but we're adding something to the universe by being here. And I believe that that's true for all levels of consciousness, every gradient of consciousness from us down to an amoeba. And the reason I kind of want to, stay away from that panpsychism is because, A, I'm not at a conclusion on it yet, but B, I think there's a distinction between how dirt operates versus how an amoeba operates. An amoeba is at least operating in an environment. It satisfies the sort of very loose functional definition of consciousness that I'm putting out there. And I believe that consciousness is something that has emerged with life. Not necessarily that the universe itself is alive, but it's something that's happening. Okay? There may be some deeper meaning to that, and we'll explore that in later videos. But for right now, I just want you, my listeners, to think about consciousness as a verb, as a process, instead of a noun. So for the second activity that I want to do with you guys, I want you to indulge me in an experiment. It's called the DRM procedure. It stands for Deese, Rodinger, and McDermott, which are the researchers who developed this procedure to examine the construction of memory. We're going to do that procedure together, and I want you to just pay very careful attention to the instructions. Don't cheat. Don't stop the video. Don't write it down as you go. Just follow the instructions and do the work at the end like you're supposed to. You'll write your list on your paper right at the very end. So with that being said, I'm going to move to those slides, and you guys can run through this exercise, and we'll kind of talk about what that means when we're done. Alright folks, so for this part of the video, what you're going to do is you're going to pause for a quick second and go grab a paper and pencil if you need it. Once you've come back, you're going to see a series of slides. Each one is going to have a set of associated words. During the slide presentation, I just want you to focus on remembering them. Don't write them down. Don't pause the video. Let them pass by at the exact speed that they're going, and just do your best to focus on them. At the end of the list, you're going to get a distraction task of math problems that you're going to have up to 2 minutes to complete. Once that task is finished, you are going to do your best to recall as many words on the list as possible within 2 minutes. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started now. Okay, now you're going to take a couple of more minutes, and you're going to try to recall as many words on the list that you can remember. And then when you're done, we're going to talk about what happens next. Okay, guys, so assuming I made my instructions clear, you've reconstructed a list after doing some math problems, right? So statistically, we know that a certain amount of people are going to remember the word sleep being on that list. It's not. Now you can back up the video if you don't believe me, but I think what I'm going to do is supply the list itself in the description of the video. So, interestingly enough, I mean, that's what's called a memory intrusion. And it's either thought to be a part of memory as a reconstructive process, where your mind is sort of compiling bits back together to make a semblance of a memory, or it's thought to be memory as a network of association, or a sort of semantic network, or that sort of a thing. For the purposes of this video, it doesn't really matter which one, because really what I'm looking at is consciousness as a process that can construct. Okay, we know that it's constructive. I mean, we've done two very constructive things. We've constructed something in the present. We constructed an operating environment that was separate from external reality. And then we kind of tested the construction of memory a little bit. I want you to take a minute and reflect on your own memories, your life, your events, and the meanings that you've made, and how maybe making those meanings has maybe influenced the way you remember things, or the way other people have interpreted those meanings for you, or the way that you believe society is going to see it. I mean, I think all of those things sort of add into the way that we reconstruct memory. I also believe that time, the passage of time and age, and the acquisition of new information changes the way we remember things and the way we make meaning from our experiences. So, I mean, that's just another thing that I wanted you to give a try, and hopefully it maybe made you think a little bit about a couple of different ways that your mind might operate that you may have not considered before. Don't remember if I mentioned it previously, but where this has come into play in our recent history is like, the unreliability of eyewitness testimony as a sole source of evidence in criminal investigations, or satanic ritual abuse in the 1980s. I mean, think about how many people's lives were absolutely ruined by that, and for the most part, it all turned out to be false memories. So I would encourage you to look that up if you don't know about that. It's an interesting thing that happened there. So that's what I want to talk about then, is as we move on in this series, we're going to talk about experience, okay? We're going to talk about perception of time. We're going to talk about perception of self. We're going to talk about meaning making, because I believe that's a huge piece of what consciousness does. But what I want to touch on right now is that there are also ways that consciousness constructs the future. And that may seem pretty obvious. We plan the future all the time. But I want to think about that in two ways. One is design. Engineers, designers, all of the problems that they're wanting to solve in one way or another is a problem that they perceive to be happening in the future. But specifically, speculative design and human factors psychology are two fields where engineering is looking to make us a better, more livable future, looking at problems that we have now or foreseen problems that we're going to have moving forward. So I would encourage you to take a look at the fields of speculative design and human factors psychology. They're both extraordinarily interesting things. Another way that we operate on the future is by pulling from the past, as a group, as a society, as a collective thing. So the next episode in the series is going to look at social constructionism, collective unconsciousness, and Jungian psychology, and some of those sort of concepts that show how us operating together and on each other affects our present, it affects our past in the way we tell our stories, but it also affects our future. I mean, this can all be indirectly evidenced empirically by looking at individual choice versus belief, buying and selling habits, mate selection, religious and cultural in-grouping and out-grouping, and the more fun thing, I think, is dream space. And I may end up doing an entire episode just based on dream space. But so to introduce this series to you, I've just shown you that why I believe consciousness is a verb. If you liked what you saw, I encourage you to click subscribe and like, and click on the Mayhem link down in the description and go join our group on Facebook. We're discussing new things every day. But for right now, I would just like you to spend a little bit of time today considering what is your own theory of mind? What do you believe about consciousness? I mean, we know we haven't arrived at a conclusion yet. So maybe you'll find something new to contribute to that. Maybe you can let us know in the comment section below. So until then, I say farewell.